Hello, everybody. My name is Dutch Owen. I am the project lead for the Milviz C310R project, which has been going on a long time, but it is now getting pretty dang close to release. So I thought it might be a good idea for me to conduct a little short flight and for you to sit along beside me and watch, and that way you'll get a pretty good idea of the basics of flying this airplane. So perhaps you won't have to study too much on the manual before we get started. Just a couple of disclaimers while you take a look at November 5225 Juliet. I'm not a professional presenter of videos. I'm an aircraft developer, so I apologize in advance for the many mistakes I'm probably going to make during this flight, verbal and otherwise. And secondly, this is a work in progress. It is a beta. It may not be perfect. It may not ever have every detail perfect. We'll be fixing it up in the next few days before we get the final release candidate out, but it's certainly in good enough shape to show you. In fact, I don't know of anything visually wrong with it at all, but if you spot something, just bear in mind our testers will surely find it and it'll be fixed before it comes out. Okay, without further ado, let's get into the cockpit and get going. This is the cockpit of the C310R, as you will see it when you first pop in, your first time in the cockpit after you've purchased our product. And so what we'd like to do is we'll give you a really quick tour of the essentials before we get started. We'll get started. The C310 does have a full set of checklists that you can follow that will tell you where things are and what to do to get started. I'm not going to be following those checklists. I'm going to be expediting this in order that we don't spend too much time in this video. I'll try to cover everything that's really essential. And the first really essential thing to talk about here before we get started anything else is what's going on in this tablet over here on the left. So let's get a close-up. Take a look at it. This controls the simulation, all the different options for the airplane and some other things. Let's get right to it. Over here on the left, the doors and attachments. These first top 5 are the various doors you can open. This is how you do it. Hey, look there. Nose baggage door opens. Nose baggage door closes. Similar with all the doors, you want them all closed for our flight, so we got them off. These are the various covers on the airplane. I'm sure you might have seen them when we were looking for their hanging off the pitot tubes, etc. Take all those off, including the control lock. Before you get started, you should have, all these should be not checked. Over here on the right-hand side, you get to decide what kind of payload you're going to be doing. By default, you have a co-pilot sitting over in the seat next to you. If you just want it to be you, take the co-pilot away. If you want the co-pilot but you don't want to see him because he doesn't look too great, you can hide him right there. You've got 6 seats in this airplane. For our flight today, we're going to carry a couple of passengers down to the beach, down to Oak Island Airport, and their baggage we'll put in the nose and in the rear. This automatically loads the weight and selects a random but reasonable weight for each passenger that you put in. All right, that's all there is here except for this passenger comfort index. This is a measure of how comfortable your passengers are during the flight. This involves the temperature inside the cockpit as well as your flying skills. We'll talk more about that as we go. Here's a chance where you get to set your fuel. All the while I'm talking about this, you can use the official Microsoft payload here and set all this up, and then once you close it, it'll all be transmitted into this and it will adapt. So this can be the master. But here we're going to just use the tablet. Normally 50% is what Microsoft Flight Simulator puts in your airplane, and we'll go with that now just for simplicity. The options tab is really important. I'm going to really quickly go through these. Back off here. The top part is navigation suites. This is the old school, no GPS suite, with just nothing but radios. This is a sort of mid-range Garmin 530-430. This is the more modern and easier to use Garmin 750 and 650, and regardless of which suite you use, and we are going to be using the 750 today, regardless of which suite, you can turn on an option to substitute a couple of more modern instruments here for the attitude indicator and the horizontal situation. I'm going to use the classic gauges because I like classic gauges. All right, taking a look at the initial state, this is really important. The default state means it starts up like any MSFS aircraft, cold and dark, all the time, every time. You can rely on it. On means it starts up in the last state you left it in. However you left the switches and dials and levers in the cockpit, that's how they're going to be when you come back into it. Rental means it starts up like the default state, except that the pilot that flew it before you got there may well have left something in a wrong position or in a position you might not expect. So all this rental says is you better check your go through your checklists very carefully. I'm not going to go through checklists carefully today, but we're going to select owned. Realism options down here. Individualization means all the 200 plus components that we track the health of in this airplane will be individualized for each individual airplane if you check this for its particular one. This is November 5225 Juliet. We're going to individualize November 5225 Juliet. This means this particular plane has a certain set of characteristics for its components. For instance, some spark plugs might not be good. We'll see this in the status page when we get to it. Engine realism means that the engines will start and operate realistically, and they can be damaged or by abuse. Systems realism means that all systems in the aircraft, except for the engines, will also operate authentically and realistically, which means you need to pay attention to all the various cautions and warnings in the manual and not just ignore them. Wear and tear means that the various engines and systems will degrade over time by use and, in fact, even by entropy, although at a much slower rate. So these four on give you maximum realism in terms of the aircraft. If you have them off, it'll fly less authentically to the manual. You have less to worry about if you turn these off. Last part is failures. If you have never checked, that means the aircraft will never fail for any reason. You can abuse the engines, nothing will happen. If you move to rarely, which is the most realistic option, that means 1% chance in every flight for a major failure and a 2% chance for a minor failure. A major would be like an engine failure or gear failure. A minor might be a circuit breaker popping or a gauge sticking. Those are pretty low percentages. Most of the time nothing will go wrong. Occasionally ups that to a 5% chance per flight of a major failure and a 10% chance of a minor failure. Frequently is 50% chance of either one. So this is for the guys that really like adventure or practicing emergency procedures. The most realistic setting is rarely. In fact, that configuration you have right there, owned, individualized, realism settings all owned, and rarely is the most realistic set of options. We did individualize this airplane, so let's go to our status page and take a look at that. This is, since we also are the owner, we're responsible for maintenance. Our status page is our maintenance shop. So it says ready for inspection or overhaul. We click the inspect button, and after a few seconds of working on it, it'll come back and it'll tell us the status of our various systems. If you chose default, all these systems would be perfect, but we chose individualized and owned. So here's what we have for this particular airplane at this particular time. If it's green, it's fine. If it's yellow, it's something you might need to look at. If it's red, it means it's broken and not even working. So the only problem we have is the oil supply is a little bit low here on the left engine. Right engine seems to be fine. There's no major components broken. If there were, it would come up and change this inspect to repair, and we could click on it and it will repair the major damage. As it is, we can do a little touch up. We can refill our oil supply on the left engine by clicking on this little gear icon, this tool icon, and it will fill it up for us. You could do that for any of these things, but obviously we're not going to be doing that this time. So all defective items replaced. That means everything is cool. We're all in the green. We're all ready to go. Go back to configuration. And that's it for the tablet. We will be talking about passenger comfort as we go. Let's get on with the flight. To get rid of this tablet, click on the column next to it. To bring it back, click on the column again. Simple enough. All right, here's our cockpit, cold and dark. Let's get rid of our yokes. By the way, the various options that you choose on a tablet and the visibility of the yokes will be remembered per aircraft livery, so you won't have to keep resetting all those things. Okay, I said we weren't going to be using the checklist. I'm going to be using a paper checklist that I use, and we're going to get started in an expedited way. All right, let's check. Our parking brake is set down there. All the covers have been removed. Wheel chocks have been removed. Control lock is out of the way because we don't see it. Windows are closed. Door is closed. We'll power up the aircraft with the battery. Turn on the alternators. Turn on the nav light and the anti-collision light to indicate to everybody outside we're going to be starting. Flip on the magnetos. Mixture's full. Props full. Throttle's open about an inch. Engine start is done by moving the primer to the left engine. If you're starting that, it will lock in place. Hold the button. It'll take a little while to start, but when it does start, the primer will pop back there and the engine is going. If it doesn't start in about 20 seconds, you've got a problem. Check everything out and make sure you're doing it right. Start our right engine. Same way. All right, both engines are started now. Let's turn on the avionics master and the avionics will start powering up. 750s. While you're doing that, let's check our fuel. Fuel on the mains is at 50%, which is about 150 pounds each. Fuel in the auxiliaries is a bit less than that, about 90 pounds each. That's normal. Let's take a look at our flight plan. Already been programmed. We're going to be going from Southern Pines Moore County Airport to overflying McCall AAF Airport, Fayetteville VOR, and down to Oak Island. We'll talk more about the flight as we get going. We'll be flying this at about 5,500 feet. Turn on our flight timer. We've been going at this 13 minutes since I started this. All right. Engines are started. Things look normal. It's a nice day. Let's get rolling. It does not take very much to get the C310 rolling. Just a little bit of juice. We will be taking off here from runway 5 at the Moore County Airport. C310 is not hard to handle on the ground. Head straight out to the runway. Do a run up. This is all an abbreviated flight. You should follow all the checklists and all the details, especially if you have failures turned on. Pull out here to runway 5. Stop. Set our parking brake. Do the run up. Run up is done. This is manifold pressure, RPM, fuel flow. Run it up to 1700 RPMs. Check each mag for no more than 150 drop. If one does drop, then you need to taxi back, shut down, and do the repair. Fuel flow looks normal. We'll do a propeller check check the propeller governors. Pull it all the way back, let it get down to about 1200, and then back to full power. And then we can roll it back for an idle test. Check the battery. This battery indicator here, when it's on battery settings, shows you the draw on the battery. When it's on idle, the battery is being drawn because the engines are not running fast enough to get the alternators to power it. Power it up to about 800 RPM to 1000, and you'll see the draw has dropped to 0. That's good. it there. Before we get going, let's talk about control of the environment. You want to keep your passengers happy. The cabin currently is cool and steady. Let's warm it up a little bit for them. That's done by the environmental controls over here. Since it's warm, we'll turn the heater on. We'll turn our temp control up to about, pointing to about the T. That's a pretty good temperature. And we'll put some cabin air and forward cabin air in. This will start warming the passengers up to a reasonable level. It won't immediately say that it's warming up, but pretty soon it will. Just missed that. Yep, it says, if you want to take a look, it says the cabin is cool but warming slowly. Okay, dismiss that. Make sure our flaps are up. Turn on strobes. Turn on our landing lights. Take a glance down here and make sure that no circuit breakers are popped out. Yes, circuit breakers can pop out as a part of the failure system. No problem there. That's a pretty good rundown. Let's get going. Release the parking brake. Taxi to the active. Stop right here. Hold the brakes. Power up to 1700 RPM. Check to make sure fuel flows. All the engines look normal. I did forget to turn the pumps on. You've turned the pumps on after you start the engines. Completely forgot that. They're on now. That's good. Alright, let's get going. Rotate at about 82 knots and we'll be lifting off at about 92. Rotate. Lift off. Pulled it up a little bit too much. Tap the brakes. Don't forget to do that. Raise the gear. Fly the airplane up to a blue line, which is about 105 knots. And climb at about 1,000 feet per minute until you're 500 feet off the ground. And we're approaching 500 feet. We will bring the manifold pressure and RPM back to the top of the green arcs over here. Turn on the autopilot. That start us off at about a 500-foot climb and switch to nav mode. And at this point, we're climbing. Once we're climbing, you can turn off your pumps. And let your airspeed build up to 130 or so knots, somewhere along in there. And then once we get straightened out on our course, we'll start climbing faster. If I'm talking a little bit louder, it's because I can barely hear you because of the engine noise in my headset. I can barely hear myself because of the engine noise in my headset. I trust you can hear me. All right, let's climb a little bit faster. Go up to 800 feet per minute. I don't know if you can see those, so I'm going to turn on some backlighting for the gauges. That'll give us more light on our gauges. Excuse me, when we're flying into the sun like this. Alright, once we're passing 2,000 feet, we need to start being concerned with mixture, moving that back a bit, and monitoring our manifold pressure to make sure we stay at the top of the green arc while we're climbing. This is called cruise climb. One way you can tell if your mixtures are right for the climb is taking a look at the EDM gauges. And adjust your mixture for maximum horsepower. There's a horsepower right up here at the top of this gauge. And so what we can do is we can adjust our mixture and kind of maximize that. Looks like 82 is our best horsepower for this climb right now, so we'll leave our mixture set there. This is a normal fuel flow for a climb at the top of the green arcs at our altitude. You'll notice on our flight plan that we have a really odd dog leg. Starting out here at our departure, going up to KHFF and then over to Fayetteville. The reason is this blue area over here is the Fort Bragg military reservation, and if we were to fly straight across that, we would have a lot of explaining to do, and we don't want to do that, so we're going down here and going down. It extends our flight a little bit, but you have to do that if you're flying in real life. And while we're cruising along here, I'll tell you this is a flight that I've made a number of times in real life. Flying friends and family and myself from the airport I learned to fly at down to the beach. Like there'll be tangent clouds here while we're at 5,500 feet, but that's okay. No major clouds. Climbing at about 120 knots. Keeping our manifold pressure up. We'll go up to 1,000 feet per minute, but when you're carrying passengers, you really don't want to go past about 1,000 feet per minute for any length of time, because you stand a chance of making their ears uncomfortable. And if their ears are uncomfortable, this index will start going down pretty severely. Cabin is comfortable and steady, 100% satisfaction. What that means is we got our controls set correctly over here. We're going to leave the heater on to keep the cabin heated, because it's going to be a lot cooler out here than it was on the ground because of the altitude. Alright, we're leveling off. As we level off, we're going to maintain our cruise climb settings. And And what this will do is it will let our speed build up to typical speed for about 5,000, 550, 500 feet, and then we'll throttle back a little bit. But it'll be interesting to see what kind of performance we get out of the 310. It's a pretty windless day, so we won't be having a tailwind driving us. We'll just have to depend on the propellers to give us some thrust. After you level off, you'll notice that the airspeed slowly builds. Not rapidly, but after a few minutes, you'll get up to your maximum. It's about time to turn off our landing light. Flip that back down to the center position, and the light will turn off. The landing lights on the 310 have extenders that come down below those pods out there. Can't really see it. I guess I could pop outside and we can see it. Yeah, there we go. See the little landing light. Okay, before we go any further with this flight, I'm gonna make it easier on my ears and turn on the headphone simulation. So if you'll indulge me for a second, I'm gonna go do that, and that will cut down on the amount of noise that's coming in my headphones. I normally do fly with headphone simulation on. I wish we could select that from inside the airplane. That would be really cool, and I hope one day we'll be able to. Alright, so the engine sounds and the other sounds are cut back quite a bit now, and we should be able to speak with a little less force, but you still should be able to hear me. Alright, we're making our first turn from KHHF onto the Fayetteville VOR. I'll resume talking about the landing light. Where is the darn thing? There it is. I guess when we're making a turn, it's hard to keep the camera focused on it. We'll have to wait till we finish this turn. Anyway, to explain that, the extender that we talked about that gets extended when you turn it on stays extended when you after you turn it off and move it to the center position, and then it retracts when you move it down. So that's what I'm going to do now, and we'll take a look, and we might be able to see it retracting back into its little receptacle. The point of doing that, the point of retracting it, is to get it out of the airstream, because it does put some drag on the airplane. It puts about 2, 3, maybe even as much as 4 knots drag on your airspeed. So whenever possible, especially at cruise, you should fly with it retracted. Once it is retracted, which takes about 10 seconds, you can move it back to the center position, and it'll stay there normally. Alright, we're established in cruise. What we're going to be talking about here in a short while is we're going to be going over a cockpit tour of all the various instruments. And as we do that, I'll try to give you some pointers or tips on the use of any particular ones that we ought to be paying something special to. The first thing let's talk about is fuel in cruise. When we're flying in cruise, you start off on the main tanks, and the manufacturer recommends that you fly 90 minutes before you consider switching to the auxiliary tanks. Do want to talk about those. The main tanks in the C310 are the ones you see out in the tips. Those are the main. This is the main tank. This is not an auxiliary tank. The auxiliary tanks are actually located in the wing on the outside out there, on both sides, obviously. So what we want to do is the manufacturer recommends 90 minutes of flight before we switch from main out here to auxiliary. But as a demo, I'm going to show you how to do it, even though we've only been flying for 15 or so minutes. Let's check our fuel. We burned about 30 pounds each on each side, and our auxiliary tanks are full right now. To switch tanks, the procedure is first of all to turn the pump on for the first tank you're going to switch. That'll be the left. If you fail to turn on the pump during this procedure and you have systems and engine realism turned on, you risk interrupting the fuel flow to the engine, which could have very negative consequences. Then we take a look down at our fuel selectors. We have the pump on. We can switch from main to auxiliary. Going back and taking a look at our fuel gauge over here, the left-hand side shows that we are now shows a reading as on the auxiliary tank. Each of these gauges by default shows the tank that is feeding the engine. Don't know if you can see it with the bright sunlight coming through the window, but this light is on, and that's a warning to indicate that we are on auxiliary fuel for that engine. Having switched one, we generally wait about 4 or 5 minutes and then switch the other one. And I'm going to explain the reason for that in just a few seconds. But right now, let's switch on our pump and switch to auxiliary on the right-hand side. So we're now running on both our auxiliary pumps. It's showing the reading on the auxiliary, and both lights are on. Now, the reason these warning lights come on to show you that you're on auxiliary is, in the C310, if you, by mistake, run your auxiliary tank dry, there's no automatic switching to the main tank. The engine will die from fuel starvation, so you need to be aware of running on the auxiliaries. The reason for not doing them both at once is, if you do one about 5 minutes ahead of the other, then if you happen to make that mistake, only one engine will die, and you can fix the problem, restart the engine before the other engine dies. If you did them both at the same time and happen to run them dry for any reason, maybe a little carelessness, you'd be in big trouble on both engines. We're on the auxiliary tanks. If you wanted to show what's in the main tanks, we just move this switch up to the top and we'll see what's in the main tanks. I'm going to switch back because we're not nearly long enough in the flight, the 90 minutes recommended. So let's switch back. We still have our pumps on. Switch back down. Bring both of these back to the main tanks. And now we can switch the pumps off. Forgetting to, if you ever forget to turn on this pump when you switch tank, probably won't forget again. Even if your engine doesn't stop, there will be a slight interruption of fuel flow. And now we can see that our lights are off and we're back on the main tanks. So that's the essence of switching those. The reason for the 90-minute recommendation is to be sure that there's enough space in the main tanks to handle the fuel return from burning off the auxiliaries. You can read in the manual about the C310's unique fuel system, but it is a fuel-injected engine, and part of the fuel that gets pumped to the engine doesn't get burned, and it is cycled back and returned to the main tanks. There needs to be room in the main tanks to hold this cycled fuel if you're burning off the aux. If there's not, it'll be vented overboard and wasted. Alright, where are we here? Let's take a look at our flight plan. We're just about 9 miles to the Fayetteville VOR. We've gone around the military reservation here. And we're moving right along. Alright, let's talk about fuel leaning, and then we'll take the cockpit tour. We're not lean enough for our altitude. I can see that from just looking at the mixtures right here. So what we're going to do is we're going to come over here and take a look at this analog gauge called the EGT gauge, which is this one right here. This shows the top 250 degrees Fahrenheit of exhaust gas temperature. What you do, if you change your mixture, you'll see that this rises and falls pretty dramatically. We're too high with a mixture, so we're going to back off the mixture. That's what I'm doing now. I'm pulling the mixture back, and we see those needles rise until they get to their peak. They don't rise anymore. That's about that. That's the peak. If I pull them down about 5 notches below that peak, which is not much at all, it's about there, then we're running lean of peak, which is a good fuel economy setting. So we set our mixtures based on the EGT for 5500 in these particular weather conditions. If we take a look at our speed, we're going about 170 knots airspeed, and ground speed 185. So that's good. We're booking right along here. We'll soon be making our turn. I would say any questions, but I'll just have to try to anticipate what your questions may be. We've covered selecting different fuel tanks. We've covered mixtures. That's a lot of the essentials here for our cruise situation. So let's just carry on with a cockpit tour of the various controls. Let's start with the switch panel down here, which we've already seen. Going left to right, the 2 fuel pumps, auxiliary fuel pumps, are right here. The engine contains 2 engine-driven pumps that don't have a switch, and then there's 2 auxiliaries. The auxiliaries are normally put on low after you start the engines and through the climb. During the climb, you can turn them off. You don't need them on in cruise unless you're switching the tanks, and you should put them in low, switch the tanks, and move them back to off. You should never, in normal circumstances, ever put these switches up to the high setting while you're running your engines, because the high setting provides enough fuel pressure to run the engine when the engine fuel pump fails. If you put them to high while the engine pump is putting out its full output, you stand a chance of forcing so much fuel into the engine that you could risk shutting it off due to too much fuel. So don't put them in high. The only reason you'd put them in high is if a fuel pump is failing. Well, how do you know when a fuel pump is failing? I'll show you. Take a look over here at the fuel flow gauge. We're at a pretty normal fuel flow for a fairly high-speed cruise. Let's back off on that a little bit. We're going 180 knots. Let's lower our manifold pressure to about a little over 2300 and lower the RPMs to about 2400. That lowers our fuel flow, and we'll lose a little speed. We can see over here we're already losing a few knots speed, but it gives us better fuel economy. Of course, that's where you have virtual fuel, or you can run it at top of the green arc all the way if you just want to get there faster. But anyway, back to the point. How do you know if a fuel pump, engine-driven fuel pump, is failing or has failed? The answer is to look at the fuel gauge. You should glance at this every once in a while. Since our settings for propellers, mixtures, and throttle are all the same for both engines, and these 2 needles should align perfectly. If they don't, something is wrong, unless these are set differently. Generally, a failing fuel pump will result in lower fuel pressure, and this is a fuel pressure gauge. So let's say the left-hand fuel pump is weak and failing, then the L gauge, you can't see the L, but the L hidden under the R will start to drop. And as it drops, that's an indication to you that that fuel pump is having problems. If it drops, say, below 50 down to 40 or so, you can provide some extra pressure with the auxiliary pump on low for the left side. But if it completely fails, if it gets dropping down here, then it's time to go ahead and use the high pressure to substitute for the engine pump. And you can continue to fly, so long as your auxiliary pump doesn't fail, you can continue to fly with a failed pump. It's generally true that anytime these needles start to separate, when you have the engine settings the same for both, is an indication of trouble. Let's say we see the right hand manifold pressure dropping with the left hand steady and no moving of controls. It's an indication there's problems with that engine. And so we have some tools to diagnose them over here, and we're going to start talking about them shortly. But it's an indication of trouble. So when you're looking over here, make sure, glancing over, make sure these needles are aligned here, and these needles here and here are in the green. Okay, back to our cockpit tour. All that's important information for checking for developing problems. Now, if you don't have engine and systems realism turned on, you have that off, you're not going to have any of these problems, so you don't really have to worry too much about monitoring this stuff. But if you have those realisms on and you have failures turned on, it is always possible to develop problems with spark plugs, cylinders, pumps, all kinds of things. Good to keep an eye out. All right, we're on our way to Oak Island Airport with 63 miles to go. Let's try to get the cockpit tour done by the time we're 20 miles out, and we'll start our descent at that point. All right, the rest of this stuff down here that we've focused in on, the primer and the starter buttons, you saw how to start the engines. The batteries, alternators, and magnetos are just fine the way they are. Moving over a little bit over here, this is the gear control. These lights go green when the gear is down and in good shape, locked down, and when they're unlocked, it's red here. That's always a problem. I'm going to lower the throttles just a little bit so we can see this switch. This switch selects what's reading on the ammeter over here. I keep it on battery. I want it to be on 0 to indicate there's no drain on the battery. I can, if I want, go take a look at the left alternator draw, the right alternator draw, battery, or the voltage, which should be 24 before engine start, 23, 24, and about 28 once the alternators are powering the bus. If there are alternator failures, these lights will show up. I should note at this point that it is possible for any of these lights to burn out and not be functional. So it's always good before a flight to do a press to test to see that they're all working. If any of them are burned out, you can use the repair facility on the tablet while parked and with the power off to repair or replace any burned out bulbs. Looks like all of our bulbs are working now. All right, continuing our tour. This is the flap lever. This lowers the flaps, and this indicates 15 or 35 degrees. Flaps, those are the 2 flap settings in the 310. You'll be seeing them shortly when we're landing. This is our heater switch. We've already covered all this. The only thing I want to say is, if you run the heater for any length of time, do not attempt to run it with the cabin air and forward air off. In fact, whenever you're using the heater, you need to have these above shut off. Obviously with the fan you should have them above shut off, but it's not absolutely critical. But with the heat, after about 5 minutes or so, you risk an overheat, which will turn on this light. If this light is on, you need to turn off your heater and let it cool down. If you don't, you could lose your heater, which if you're flying in a cold day, your passengers won't appreciate not having a heater. All right, moving on to the engine instruments over here. We've already talked about manifold, RPM, fuel flow. These are normal. The cylinder temperatures, pressures, oil pressure, fuel gauge, we've talked about that. That's the aux. That's the main quantities. EGT, flying on pretty lean for a good fuel economy. This is a vacuum pressure gauge. It should be pointing to the green. Tells you whether you have vacuum pressure for the vacuum powered instruments. There are 2 vacuum pumps, 1 on each engine. If any of them, if one fails, a warning light will illuminate in this area down here. If both fail, you'll see 2 lights. The instruments will work off 1 pump, so you don't need to. I'm powering back up. I forgot to crank the power back up, so we lost a good bit of speed there. No problem. We're not in a hurry. But as long as 1 pump is running on 1 engine, you'll keep it in the green and only 1 light, one warning light. This is an outside air temperature gauge, analog gauge. We can see a more precise readout of the outside air temperature on the EDM gauges, and we'll see that in a minute. This is another altimeter. And this is a copy and another clock, duplicates of the ones on the pilot side. In the center we have avionics. You can see that there can be various suites. The 530s, the 750s, the radios can be switchable from the tablet. We're not going to go into how to operate the avionics. They're pretty standard stuff. This is a standard Asobo Cap 140 simulated standard Asobo EDM, and this is the PMS 50 GTN 750 suite. Over here on the pilot side, we have a standard 6-pack right here. You've seen that we can, if we want to, we can go to options and turn on G5s if you like those. Like I say, I like the classic gauges. Standard 6-pack, airspeed, attitude indicator, altimeter, turn coordinator, horizontal situation indicator, and vertical speed. Up here we have the standard clock. Down here we have an ADF gauge. We have an ADF in this airplane. This is a readout for a DME distance. I can demo that pretty quick by tuning us to the Fayetteville VOR. And we'll see a readout here. We're 26.1 miles away from it, traveling at 170 knots ground speed, 10 minutes to it. Of course, we're flying away from it. If you want to get the information for nav 2, you can simply switch that, and it would give you a nav for the nav 2. We're going to stick on nav 1 here. Alright, I'm going to have a talk about the switch panel over here, and then we'll go back to the EDMs and explain these, and then we'll be done with our cockpit tour. How are we doing on the mileage? 47 miles. I've got enough time to talk a little bit more. Alright, so this row of switches across the top controls anti-icing on the left side and lights on the right side. This is the airframe de-icing. Moving that up will activate the airframe boots out here. Moving it back down will deflate them. And moving it all the way down will activate a cycle that will automatically operate the boots every few minutes to keep ice from forming on your leading edge if you're in heavy icing. This is propeller icing. If you need to de-ice the propeller blades, turn this on. If they have already frozen up and there's ice on the blades, then once they start to melt, the pellets will fly off and hit the fuselage, and you'll hear that sound. This is a windshield heat. Turn that on and it'll de-ice your windshield. Pitot heat, so you can keep the pitot from freezing up. It's Avionics Master. It's the only one that doesn't fit de-icing and lighting, and it's right in the middle. This is a de-ice light. Turn this on and it'll illuminate the wing so you can see if there's light on it, ice on it at night. The rest of these are lights: anti-collision, strobe, navigation, taxi light, which is attached to the front wheel assembly, the landing light we've already talked about, and then these rheostats control the lighting of gauges. This one controls the backlighting of the gauges on the pilot side. This one controls the backlighting of the radio and also backlighting of the tablet. So if the tablet's too bright at night, you can turn this down and it'll dim your tablet. This is the engine gauges, which are the gauges on the co-pilot side, and this rheostat controls the lighting of this switch panel itself. Just for reference, the cabin lighting, there's a red, this controls the red spotlights that illuminate the panel at night, and this controls the ambient lighting for the passengers. So that's all the lighting. We did take a little detour there. The only other things on here are, these are emergency switches for emergency procedures. They may be referenced in emergency procedures. Don't use them unless you're in a dire emergency, and then do it only when they say. These do work. The circuit breakers are all legitimate circuit breakers. They will deactivate an electrical circuit if you pop them out, and they can pop out due to minor failures. We call them minors. Some of these things may not be minor to you. If I pull it out, it'll deactivate the DBS. The fuel low light is a pretty harmless thing, so I'll show you what it looks like. If they do pop out, you'll see a red ring that'll make it pretty obvious it's popped. If it happens, you can push it back in. If it stays in, you're golden, and if it pops back out, you've got a short circuit. Don't try to push it back in again. These two big breakers down here are for the alternators. If an alternator fails, these may pop. If both pop, it means your alternators are both failed, and you're on battery, so land pretty quick. Alright, that pretty much covers our cockpit tour, except for the pedestal. Here are the throttles, here are the prop RPM gauges, here is the mixture. This is the pitch trim, up and down, now being controlled by the autopilot, generally set on takeoff up here to take off, and otherwise you can manipulate it manually. This is a rudder trim to do rudders, and this is the aileron trim. If you find that the 310 rolls a little bit to the left, which it has a tendency to do, you can adjust this just slightly over and correct that roll and get it nice and evened out if you like to hand fly it and not let the autopilot do everything. The cowl flaps are down here. You can pull them out to offer a little more cooling to the engines. They are internal cowl flaps, not external. They don't have a dramatic effect on the engine temperature. Okay, the last thing is our EDM gauges, and I saved the best for last here. I do want to explain what these can do for you in terms of finding out what's happening to your engines. Let me see if I can get close up to them, as close as it'll allow. This is the left-hand engine, this is the right-hand engine. You'll notice that these gauges are not all even. That's because we individualized this airplane. If you had not individualized it, these would all be level and everything's the same. To read these, there are 6 cylinders across the top, numbered 1 through 6, and as this little dot moves beneath the cylinder numbers, that's the cylinder that's being displayed. You'll notice that the cylinders are quite different from one another. That's because it's individualized. This last column shows oil and turbine inlet temperature. These columns show on the top large part of the bar, that's the exhaust gas temperature, the raw exhaust gas temperature. And the bottom little tick is the cylinder head temperature, which is always lower than the exhaust gas temperature. What you're looking for here is abnormalities. There's normally some variation, but if one cylinder starts to rise or fall dramatically different than the others, it's likely a problem with that cylinder or the plugs in the cylinder. And it's something you have to watch out for and keep an eye on. I'll show you how to do that. There's 2 buttons underneath these that control these things. It's normally in automatic mode. You can see that it's stepping through the different cylinders and the different data points here. If you want to stop that from happening, press the left button and it will go into manual mode. That'll stop the automatic sequences. Then every time you push this button, it will move to another cylinder or to the data points that are in the T column. So this is cylinder 2. It's a little bit high. I'm going to place this little pointer on cylinder 2 so I can monitor it, and it gives me a digital readout, 960 degrees Fahrenheit EGT and 222 Fahrenheit cylinder head temperature. If you want to see Celsius, make sure this is in automatic mode and hit that button, and it will switch to Celsius temperatures instead of Fahrenheit. And then we can go back to manual at that point and get us back on cylinder 4 over here, and we're looking at Celsius instead of Fahrenheit temperatures, which at those temps are not that different. Alright, over here, what I like to do is I like to put either of these on any particular cylinder I'm interested in monitoring, and if I want to read, let's say, the outside air temperature, then I can press the left button to stop the automatic mode. Press it again until I get to this column, and press it until it says OAT, 39 degrees OAT. So that's our outside air temperature. Switching it to Celsius, I can start the automatic mode again, hit that, stop the automatic mode, and cycle it back around to outside air temperature. Well, I didn't change it. Make sure that we're in automatic mode. There, we did a proper switch. Stop it and move back over here. and we're at 4 outside air temperature Celsius. These are a partial implementation of EDMs. They're not a full implementation. The actual real-life EDM can do a lot more than that. It has a lean find function and a pilot programming function. These are partial, but they do allow you to monitor what's going on in your cylinders and some other interesting data that you can display here using these buttons. The manual gives you all the details. And these are significant numbers to monitor because we are monitoring the health of each cylinder. And we can fail cylinders if you have failure turned on, and you will get a warning by these numbers getting out of whack before the actual cylinder does fail. How are we going? We're 20 to almost 20 miles. This is working out nearly perfectly. Let's begin our descent into the area around Oak Island Airport preparatory to landing. So what we're going to do here is let's descend to 2,000 feet and switch to vertical speed mode and start a 700 foot per minute descent, and I'll back my manifold pressure down to about 19. This prevents us from going too fast and gives us a nice rate of descent, 700. Like I've reminded you before, the passenger comfort index is important. If you descend at too high a rate for too long, that is more than 1,000 feet per minute for more than 30 seconds, you will begin to affect this comfort index. Then the more drastic you descend, the more their ears hurt and the more this goes off. It gets worse. It gets to yellow and then eventually get to red. That means they're really mad at you. Okay, we're now descending. I'm going to crank it down a little bit to about 1,800 and descend maybe at 900 feet per minute. That way we get down sooner rather than later. Now, this is a flight that I've made a number of times in my life, and not an Cessna 310. I would love to fly a Cessna 310. I've never flown one in real life, but I have flown single-engine airplanes into this airport quite a bit. The runways are runway 5 and 23. We can see from our wind that the wind is basically westerly, but not very much. That probably means that we're going to land on runway 23. So in anticipation of that, I'm going to move my pointer on my horizontal situation indicator to approximately the runway heading. This helps keep me aligned with the runway when we're approaching the airport. It's just an aid to the pilot to help me remember what the heck's going on. As we descend, we have to keep reducing the manifold pressure because it does tend to creep up as we get into thicker air. Passenger comfort index still perfect. Temperature is still perfect. Thermostat on here is holding this correctly. Since it's a little bit of a cool day, we shouldn't have to turn that heater off until we land in order to keep them comfortable. But that's something you'll get used to, managing the temperatures in here if you're interested in doing that. If you're not interested, then what the heck, let them suffer. As we go down, we need to prepare, so we'll turn on our pumps. We'll want those pumps for the approach and landing. We'll turn on our landing light out here. That will cause the landing lights to extend, which will add a little drag, but we aren't concerned about drag. When we're in our descent, we're trying to slow down anyway, so it's no big deal. Down to 3,000. I don't know how well you can see the what's going on out there. This is the ocean. And Oak Island, where folks like to go and stay, or any of these beaches all along here are resort beaches, is over there. Oak Island's an interesting place. People do live on it, but no cars are allowed, no vehicles. So all the vehicles there are like golf carts, and I think electrical power might be in there. There's no bridge, no car access. The only way you get over is through by a ferry. It's quite an interesting and beautiful place to stay. Our airport is out there, and we're coming down perpendicular to the runway. And we're going to land on runway 23, I think. Let's listen in to the ASOS at Brunswick County, which is Oak Island Airport, and see what they say about the wind.
Kilo Sierra Uniform Tango Automated Weather Observation 2100 Zulu. Wind 279er at 7. Visibility 9er. Sky condition, few clouds at 1,800 feet, few clouds at 4,800 feet, ceiling 300 feet broken. Temperature 15C dew point, 13C altimeter 299er2.
Alright, so 270 at 7 knots, that tells us we are definitely going to be landing on runway 23. So let's descend a little further. Let's do some hand flying. I love to hand fly the C310. It's a beautiful airplane to hand fly. There's no reason why I should stay on the autopilot, so I'm simply going to shut it off here. You'll see that it rolls slightly to the left. That's because of the torque of the engines. It can be compensated for with aileron trim, or simply when you're flying it, it's rather natural to give it a slight tilt over to the right. The slower we go, the more that roll is pronounced. Alright, taking a look at our speeds, we're going to be approaching at a roughly blue line, which is about 105 to 110 knots. When we get on final, we'll come in at about 95, 96 knots. When across the threshold at about 92, 92, and then flare and land. There's nothing super special or incredibly difficult about this airplane. It flies pretty much like other aspirated, except that it's fast. So it is a high performance airplane. It does some gigs I'm used to, but it doesn't have any really characteristics you need to really pay attention to, except you do need to be aware that when you have full fuel, your main tanks are out on the wings. And so what that does is it causes it to roll a little bit different than you may be used to. But that's no big deal. You'll get used to it soon enough. A lot of people don't even notice it. Okay, for our speeds, 158 is the flaps 1 speed, 138 is the gear, and the flaps 2 speed. Basically, on approach, you want to be sure to keep it in the white arc here on your airspeed, which we're not having a problem doing. We'll reduce to about 1800. We can't really, I can see the airport, but only because I know what it looks like. It's right there. The runway is stretching right there. So we're about ready to turn on to downwind. The airport is, as you can see, just about at sea level. And we'll see how we do with this landing. The 310 is not a particularly difficult airplane to land. The technique's about the same as you use for any twin. Let's start our roll onto downwind. This is why I like to have the horizontal situation indicator here, so that I can know how I'm oriented to the runway. So our downwind will be the opposite to how we're going to land. About 800 feet is pattern altitude, so we're flying at 800 feet on a downwind. I'm not going to waste my time talking to nobody with the radio about downwinds. I'm monitoring traffic right now, and in fact, nobody's saying anything, so I think we got the airport pretty much to ourselves. Speed's pretty good at 120 knots. I can drop the gear. As I do, it'll put a bit of drag on the airplane, and so I have to trim up a bit. It's not such a big deal. Gear is down, and we'll be turning on to base here shortly. There is no ILS. I can really see out there. There is no ILS at this airport, so it's all going to be visual. All right, we have gear down. We'll ramp up our RPM a little bit. and turn onto base. And probably just keep on turning onto final. It's nice to have the GTN 750 showing me where the airport is, so I'll know, get some idea of how I'll line up. So here I am out here turning onto base and then to final at about 110 knots. Not a bad airspeed. There's the airport. We did extend our final a little bit while I was talking to you. Not a big deal. It's a little bit hard to be talking about flying and flying at the same time. All right, pumps are on, landing lights are on, gears down, 3 green. Engine instruments are looking good. Line up on final. Speed is good. Just where we want to be. Start reducing manifold pressure, start our 500 foot per minute descent on final. Drop flaps. We're at 15 degrees, got the airport made, go down to 30. I often put the flaps on when I'm in downwind or turning base. Just didn't do it that time, so. Landing the 310 is not difficult. We're about 95 knots, which is a good approach speed at this point. You should not get too much faster than that. Come down at about 500 to 700 feet per minute. As we cross the threshold, we began to flare and reduce power. And the 310 touches down gently. Doesn't take a lot of rudder to keep it straight unless you're facing a particularly severe tailwind. You don't want to stand on the brakes if you have systems realism turned on. Excessive braking can heat up brakes and cause excessive wear and tear, which you'll have to repair if you're the owner. And if you don't and let them burn down to where they fail, you'll lose your brakes and you'll be in a world of hurt. Don't do that. Exiting the runway here. Having exited the runway, we can turn off our pumps. One thing I didn't do there, I completely forgot, was to, this is the consequence of using a checklist, not using a checklist. You should always use a checklist. I didn't put my mixtures on full for a sea level landing. That's a big no-no. Don't do that. We can turn off our strobes, turn off our landing light. We don't want to retract it yet because it's hot, and we don't want to retract a hot light into that receptacle, so we'll let it cool off in the air a little while, and then we'll do the retraction when we shut down the airplane. Man, I can't believe I forgot the mixtures. Don't do what I do. I see a marshaller there telling us where to park, so we're just going to go ahead and pull in here. It's easy to give it too much gas on the ground. The 310 does not require much fuel on the ground. So, there we go. We're here. Set the parking brakes. Kill the engines with the mixtures. Bring the props back. Turn off your heater. I like to leave these where they are. If it worked before, it'll work again. I'm the owner, so remember, oh, I need to retract the flaps. That was silly, not to do it on the runway. I'm the owner, so when I come back into 5225 Juliet, these will all be restored and be set to where I left them. So I kind of like to leave them where they are. Leave that on battery. Switch off my magnetos, my alternators, the battery on for a little bit. Turn off the avionics, switch off the lighting. I like to leave these on, particularly because if I come in here at night the next time, the lights will be on for me. I won't have to fumble around in the dark using the flashlight to set them. All right, our little parking brake is set. These are off. That's off. Everything's pretty much how I want to leave it for the next time I fly my airplane here. So I will switch off the battery. And we have completed our flight. Thank you so much for listening to me for this entire tutorial flight. I hope it's been fun. I hope it's been entertaining. I hope it's been informative. And I hope you really enjoy the Cessna 310 from Milviz for Microsoft Flight Simulator. Bye, and I'll see you on the next tutorial video. We may do one on night operations. We may do one on emergency procedures. We may go into more depth on the tablet. At any rate, thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.